Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. And I'm joined today by Saam Trivedi, who is a professor of philosophy at, Brooklyn College and at the CUNY Graduate Center. So Saam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Brandon, for having me and also for the very nice review of my book that you wrote a couple of years back.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the book. And so here is the book, which is Imagination, Music, and the Emotions, a Philosophical Study. We have two copies. We have dueling puppy dogs.
Yeah. Facing different directions.
Yeah. From SUNY Press in 2017. And so in the book, you're dealing with the question that many philosophers of music have dealt with over the years of music and the emotions. And so I just want to start with the question of why is this a question that philosophers have come back to time and time again? It seems to be, the hard problem in the philosophy of music, right? If the hard problem in philosophy of mind is consciousness, this seems to be like the hard problem. It's the one that, so many people have dealt with, and there are so many views, and there doesn't really seem to be a consensus. And so could you just talk us through briefly why this is a question that philosophers have engaged with so often?
Okay, so if you think about it, really the problem goes back, at least in the West. You've got Plato in the Republic talking about music and the emotions. Right? There are certain Greek modes he doesn't like. He doesn't like the Ionian mode, which is roughly C to C on the white notes on a keyboard or a piano. He likes the Phrygian mode, however, which is E to E, white notes, roughly, on a keyboard or a piano. You find also outside other cultures, right? For example, in Indian classical music, right? You have these rags, these melodic patterns that are associated with certain moods or feelings or emotions, also with certain times of day and certain seasons, right? The problem is one that the mystery doesn't go away. Music itself is without life, consciousness, and mental states, right? And yet, many of us, not everyone, many of us, both musicians and laypersons, hear music right away as sad, happy, anguished, tranquil, and so on, right? How can that be? Now, it makes sense to say that you and I can be sad or happy, right? We have consciousness, we have feelings, we have emotions, moods, we are alive, right? It makes sense to say maybe that dogs and cats can be sad or happy, right? Maybe primates also. I have a colleague, by the way, who works on animal minds. So cats and dogs, primates, chimpanzees, okay, they can be sad or happy. But music itself is just a set of sounds, okay? Purely instrumental music without words or an associated story or program. How can that be sad or happy, right? And that's the problem that many philosophers have grappled with. Peter Kivy put it very well. He said, the mystery doesn't go away so easily. Right? He, I think, made at least 3 attempts that I know of to try and solve the problem or deal with it. There's a great essay by Oke Bausma, published sometime in the mid-1950s, who also says there's some sad music. Sad music? How can music be sad or happy, right? So that's the mystery, and it doesn't go away. I myself might add, I used to have more confidence that I solved the problem.
Okay, great. So what is your view, right? You've attempted to, in the book, you've presented a solution to the problem of musical emotion and musical expression. And so could you just talk us briefly through your view, and then we can get into it?
Okay, sure. So my view tries to do many things. What I say at heart is music isn't literally sad or happy, right? Elementary biology tells us this. Music can't really or literally be sad or happy, right? What I say is music is imagined to be sad or happy in a variety of ways, which are not always very conscious, very highly foregrounded. Okay, sometimes we may hear a persona or an agent in the music. Sometimes we might animate the music. We might imaginatively project life and mental states onto the music, onto the sounds we hear. Okay, there may be other ways also of imagining music as sad or happy or whatever. Okay, what allows these imaginings of various kinds, what's the causal story underlying this, is various resemblances between music on the one hand and various things to do with affective states on the other hand, such as the way we express our emotions and feelings through our voices. It's something that Peter Kivy latched onto, or the way we express our emotions and other affective states through our body, through our movement, through our gestures, through our stance, our gait, our carriage, okay, something that Stephen Davies picks on. Or sometimes music might resemble the way emotions feel. There's a very famous quote from the psychologist Carol Pratt. He says, music sounds the way emotions feel. And Malcolm Budd picked up on this in one of his earlier books. So music mirrors the way our emotions feel, our inner lives feel. Our inner lives have tension, okay, that needs to be resolved. Music is like that often, right? There are tremblings and agitations in our inner life that we feel. Music also feels like that. So in virtue of all these resemblances, we hear music as sad or happy. We imaginatively project emotions and feelings onto the music. One of the things I'm trying to do in the book is it's a syncretic view, as you noted in your review. The view synthesizes the persona view, the resemblance theory, and the expression theory. I am, however, I don't accept any of them completely, though. I do criticize them. I also criticize views that appeal to arousal, to metaphors, and also formalist views of music expressiveness. So that, in a nutshell, is the view. I call it a resemblance plus imagination view. Sometimes I call it imaginationist, just for brevity. So, yeah.
Great. And so, you mentioned some of the views that you sort of borrowed from, plus the ones that you contrasted with. And I'd rather focus not on the ones that you've contrasted yours with, like the metaphor views or formalism, which you just dismiss more or less outright, and I think rightly so. You borrow heavily, I think, from the persona view, which is Jenefer Robinson, Jerrold Levinson, and from resemblance views and also arousal views. And so I guess my first question is, why don't you think the resemblance view sort of in and of itself is enough, right? I mean, someone like Kivy or Malcolm Budd or Stephen Davies, all of whom you mentioned, right, think that, music embodies or, it expresses emotion by resembling our inner lives or our sort of outward behaviors or gestures, right? Why do you think that sort of isn't enough to sort of solve the problem?
Okay, so there's three kinds of things I say against the resemblance theory very quickly. One is, look, what's the basic problem? The basic problem of musical expressiveness is, how can music, something without life, consciousness, mental states, be heard readily and immediately, willy-nilly, as sad, happy, and so on, okay? This problem is not explained by the resemblance theory, right? In contrast, my view says, look, we are projecting these things, emotions, mental states, affect states, life consciousness onto the music right away in ways we are not aware of. Okay, so the resemblance doesn't quite address the problem. That's one issue. Another is that resemblance is not the same thing as expressiveness. They're different concepts. Okay, so that's another kind of concern that I have. And another concern I raise is resemblance may be necessary to hear musical expressiveness, but it's not sufficient. All kinds of things resemble the way sad people move. Okay, so turtles and snails walking slowly with their heads low to the ground. Okay, but we don't see them usually as expressive of sadness. We don't see this movement as expressive of sadness. So resemblance is not sufficient to explain musical expressiveness. It may be necessary, it may be the causal story underlying musical expressiveness, but we need to add more to this picture. And I suggest we need to add imagination. Even in the case of turtles and snails, if you add some kind of story, right, some kind of pretend story or make believe, right? I think this is an example I use somewhere in the book. Right? You can imagine a story, children's story or a folk tale, right? Turtles, originally they had wings, let's say. And then they did something very egregious. And the gods got mad at them. And they said, hey, you turtles, you need to be cut down in size. They clipped their wings and turtles fell down. And forever, turtles have been sad, walking slowly with their heads down to the ground, lamenting the loss of their wings, okay, and their freedom. So if you build some kind of story like this that ties imagination to resemblance, then you can see this movement as expressive of sadness, but usually we don't. So that's another concern then, that resemblance is not necessary. Resemblance is necessary but not sufficient for expressiveness. So that's the kind of things I say against resemblance, even as I borrow from the resemblance views.
Yeah, right. And with the turtle example, right, sort of in contrast to music, there hasn't been, this sort of culture built up around, maybe if you belong to a culture that has this myth or story about turtles, then, every time you see a turtle, it's sad in a particular way. And, if you see two turtles like one after another, right, that, this one's sad in this sort of way, and this one's sad in another way. And then you can have sort of all of these nuanced imaginings with respect to them. Whereas with music, sort of the culture has built up around it in such a way that, if you're thinking about, music in ancient Greece, right, it was, more or less, always accompanying plays, right? And so certain modes fit certain, tragedy or comedy or certain scenes in those. And so, the culture of talking about emotions with respect to the music, it's sort of always been adjacent to, and now, there's a way of thinking through it in that sense. And so do you want to talk about that briefly, and then we can talk about persona theory?
So you want to talk about culture and how it
Yeah,
relates?
yeah. How sort of culture sort of figures into how we imagine music to be sad, happy, etc.
Excellent, excellent. So one of the things I do say in my book, and this is against Kivy, is that cross-cultural perceptions of musical expressiveness do happen, right? People from other cultures who don't really know much about music or a different culture, right? They can often hear music from these other foreign alien cultures as expressive, as sad, happy, whatever, right? And I've cited some empirical data to support this, which let me read out one short paragraph from page 84 from my text, and I'll say a lot more quickly. Okay, so page 84 in my text, in my book, there's a paragraph, I think it's let me just dig it out. Here we go. Page 84 is the paragraph that's like 10 lines to the top. I'll read it out, short paragraph. A fair bit of recent empirical psychological data, in fact, supports my claim against Kivy that musical expressiveness can be and often is perceived or heard across cultures. I saw an article by Saam and Schellenberg. For example, Western listeners can often hear happiness, sadness, and anger in Hindustani or North Indian classical music. There's a study by Bachman and Thompson, which gets cited very often. Similarly, the Mafa from Cameroon, West Africa, who are unfamiliar with Western music, can nevertheless hear sadness, happiness, and fear, bits of it. There's a study by Fritz that I cite here. In like manner, Japanese listeners can hear sadness, happiness, and anger in Hindustani music that they are unfamiliar with. Again, there's another study by Bachman, Thompson, and Matsunaga that I cite. None of this is to deny that listeners are usually better at hearing emotions in music of their own cultures than in music of other cultures. I've cited here again studies by Bockwell, Fritz, Locke, and so forth. Okay, so what I say here is, look, I mean, I find myself, and I listen to all kinds of music, and I even play, music from different cultures when I teach philosophy music to my students. I think I can hear expressiveness in music from West Africa, from Mali, Kora, this instrument, right, which I think sometimes I can hear expressiveness in music from the Middle East or music from Indonesia, gamelan, right? But I'm not 100% sure. Okay, someone who knows the musical conventions of those musical cultures, the history of those musical cultures, knows their traditions, knows how the instruments are used, right? Knows the practices and so forth, would have a better grip on these things than I do. Okay. But I think you would also need to know broader things in those cultures at large, not just things in the musical culture, but also things about the arts broadly in that culture, about their religions, about how their society is structured, okay, about their history, about their media, and so forth, right? So that's one thing I would say, okay, that yes, your musical culture does shape your experience of musical expressiveness, okay? And also you need familiarity with the broader culture at large, okay? Well, I'll add two more things to that. There's a paper I've been working on that these things are coming out in. I think you need a lot of intellectual curiosity to access, to hear music from other cultures. Most of us, okay, most people that you and I know only listen to various kinds of rock music or various kinds of Western popular music. They might listen to some jazz or some country music or hip hop or something else, okay? And this is why we need to broaden our horizons, okay? And I'm going to borrow a thought from Kathleen Higgins. It's a point she makes in her book, The Music of Our Culture. She says, look, we expose our children to different foods, different cuisines, right? You have sons of your own, 9 and 6 now, right? They eat Italian food, they eat, Mexican food, they eat, Japanese food or Ethiopian food or Peruvian food, right? We expose our children to different languages. We want them to learn languages through school, right? Spanish or French or Russian or Italian or Mandarin or whatever, Swahili or whatever, right? Similarly, we should also broaden our horizons when it comes to music, expose our children to music from different cultures. So that I think needs a lot of intellectual curiosity. So that's a second point that I want to make. And the third point I want to make is that we need at least some intellectual humility to hear music from other cultures. Okay, there will likely be some things in common between the music we know and music of other cultures. Right, we're all the same species. We're all Homo sapiens. We all have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? If I remember my biology correctly. But look, there's also going to be some differences between, our music, the music we know, right? Music most of us hear, and music from other cultures, right? We shouldn't assume that all that applies to Western music will apply in the same way and to the same degree, right? So there will be some differences most likely, and we should be sensitive to them and respect them. Okay? So that's what I will say very quickly about this.
Yeah, and some cultures as well have, really elaborate and refined aesthetic theories with respect to music or the arts in general, right? And so if you're thinking of Indian or South Asian music, Rasa theory, which has been, under development for a couple millennia almost now, right, if not longer, right, that there's this really rich, these really rich, thick concepts. And if you want to understand, Hindustani classical music or anything of that sort, then getting into the aesthetic theories that surround them. And okay, this particular rasa is the one that the piece is aiming at, and so we need to sort of figure out that mood is and what the sort of subsidiary moods that help to build to the larger one is, and so yeah, that the intellectual curiosity and humility is absolutely essential there in order to get make your way into cultures other than your own.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's on the right track. I'm not going to disagree with that too much. Yeah.
Awesome. And so can we talk about persona theory a bit? And so, yeah, so persona theory, right? So how does your view diverge from persona theory of musical expression, right? Persona theory is, just roughly that we imagine a persona as experiencing the emotions that we hear in the music, as opposed to, the not the arousal view, but rather the expression view of like Tolstoy or Collingwood, which is that, it's the composers or performers' emotion that are being expressed through the music. The persona theory is, there's some indefinite persona that we imagine as if it's experiencing the music. So how does your view differ from the persona theorists, Jenefer Robinson, Jerrold Levinson, and so forth?
Yeah, so the persona theory says, look, often in hearing the music, we imagine there's an indefinite agent in the music, someone or something in the music that's expressing its emotions through the music's development, its gestures, and so forth, right? And I'm sympathetic. I say, yes, we may often imagine persona, but I think that's not all we do. There may also be other kinds of imaginings involved in hearing music as expressive. We may often project life and mental states, right? The music itself is heard as possessing these affective states we hear in the music. It's as if the music is a being that we create, that our minds, that we create, okay? And this has resonances with Marsilio Ficino, Italian Renaissance philosopher, who had this view back in the 15th century of music being like an animal or being that moves. He had a music spirit theory. So my view is something like that. So the persona is only one kind of imagining. There may be other kinds of imaginings. And as to how my view differs from the persona view, well, my view is broader, but I do say somewhere on page 140, I think in my book, the last paragraph on page 140, going on to 141, that one difference between our animating music itself, as contrast with the persona, is that the persona is an imagined agent that's somehow in the music. It is distinct from the music, but somehow in the music. In contrast, when we animate the music, when we endow it with life and mental states, imaginatively, right, that's the music itself. Okay, so the persona is something that mediates between the music on the one hand and the listener on the other hand. But when we listeners endow the music, project life and mental states onto the music in our imaginations, there's nothing mediating between the music and the listener, right? These things are just projected onto the music itself. So that's one difference that I'll pick on. For the rest of it, I'll refer you to page 140, 141, around there. I could read out that paragraph, but it's rather long, and I think you probably don't want me to read out.
Yeah. Great. And so, yeah, I mean, the difference, as you point out, is that the persona is meant to mediate, right? It's sort of we invest or we sympathize with, or we're getting insight into a persona. And, there may be some pieces where that's, entirely appropriate and in a sense intended by the composer, right? And so I'm thinking about, Beethoven's Coriolanus, right? Where, okay, there is a persona and in a sense we're inside his head, right? For the duration of the suite. Whereas with other music, other pieces of music, and that's a case of, not, it's instrumental music, but it's non-absolute because it, has a title and program associated with it. But in pieces of absolute music where there is no clear persona, I do feel like, what you're getting at with your view, which is, an original contribution to the current debate. And I think it fits my experience, at least, is that in a sense it's the music's emotions that we're experiencing, that we're encountering, and if we're feeling emotions in response to it, it's sort of the sympathetic response to the music itself, that the music is the thing expressing. It's not the composer, it's not the performer. It could be sometimes, right? If a blues guitarist is like really wincing and getting into it, and like what his face and body matches what the guitar is doing and sounding like, then we could say, okay, this is a direct expression of this person's emotions on this occasion. Whereas other times that just seems inappropriate, and or at least it's not possible, right? Just the staid piano player, affectless, and yet still pouring their heart and soul into this, maybe, or mechanically reproducing it, and yet musically it's deeply rich and emotional. And so, yeah, I feel like your view, again, at least fits my experience, and I'm sure it fits your experience.
Yes,
as
it
well.
does, actually. Thank you. Yes. And I actually, my view came to me through experience. One of the things I used to do much more when I was younger. I used to improvise a lot on this hammer dulcimer that I play. And one day when I was in graduate school, I had this feeling while improvising that these emotions that I'm hearing in the music are somehow being created by me. You get these sounds that are being created by me as I'm playing, right? They have the emotions. That doesn't make sense unless somehow I'm investing these sounds with emotion, or some kind of affective state or consciousness of life. Yeah. So, and others have told me that. And I worked on my view for many years. I've tried to work it out through different papers, which people often do. Analytic philosophers especially do that. And most of my training has been as an analytic philosopher. I first tried to work out my view in a paper that appeared in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism back in 2001. But I tried to put forth some of these ideas. And then later the book emerged later. I worked out different chapters, try to work out the ideas, through papers in journals, through book chapters, and so forth.
Yeah. So, I mean, I really like the idea that it's the music itself, right? And so I mean, we have the issue of music expressing emotion, but then we have the issue that parallels it to some degree of music arousing emotion in us. And so do you think it's something like empathy or sympathy with the sort of lived being that we imaginatively project the music to be, is sort of that's what's eliciting our emotional response? It's not necessarily we're feeling the same emotion, right? Because, in response to someone's anger, we could feel derision or sadness or fear, right? And so it's not like a one-to-one parallel between what's happening in the music and what's happening in us. Sometimes it is, but not often. But could you talk through that?
Sure. I do say something very much like that in the last chapter of my book. I say that when we are aroused to affective states by music, that may involve a kind of empathy or sympathy or imaginative identification with the persona in the music or with the music itself. And that's what causes arousal. I mean, some people use the word contagion, emotional contagion, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. So, that's what I think I suggest is going on. I think that's roughly right.
Yeah, and one thing that you say that's really provocative in the book that you don't talk too much about, now now that I have the opportunity to talk to you, I want to give you the opportunity to say more, is that sometimes it feels as if it's our emotions that the music is expressing. It's not some indefinite persona. It's not the music's emotions. It's my emotions that I'm feeling, that I'm experiencing as I'm listening to this piece. So could you just say a bit more what you're thinking with respect to there? Because
Yeah,
that also feels right to me.
yeah. I've tried to keep the view open-ended. That's why, and I have to say, as I get to answer this question, the imagination is very elusive. It's very hard to pin it down. It happens in ways that are not always highly foregrounded, and we often imagine things in the as-if mode. And in the case of feeling as though the music is expressive of our emotions, it feels as if the music is expressive of our emotions. We identify with the music itself. And I'm going to quote here some very famous lines from T.S. Eliot, the poet T.S. Eliot, that I'm not the first to quote. They're quoted in my book on page 177 in endnote 5. I'll read them out. Malcolm Budd, who I studied with for a little bit in England many years back, also quotes these lines. Page 177, footnote 5 to chapter 6. Okay, here are T.S. Eliot's words from 4 quartets from the Prior Salvages. Malcolm Budd also quotes them. Here's T.S. Eliot. It says, quote, music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. End of quote. Okay, so that puts it very well. You identify with the music, you feel that the emotions you hear in the music are your own. They're not really your own, but it's kind of imaginative identification. Okay, so I'm very sympathetic to that. I wish I could say more, but this is where the elusive quality of music, you know, of imagination, of the imagination comes in. And I think I don't know if I can say much more to, you know, sort of explain this. I think many of us have this experience. I think many listeners do, that you identify with the music. You feel that it's expressing your emotions. I had this experience very powerfully once as a young man, as an undergraduate. I was at a performance where Beethoven's violin concerto was being performed. And I really had this very strong sense during the second movement, which is a slow movement, that it was expressing my own emotions, which I can't describe it, but it's something I've had very often, of identifying with music, feeling that it's expressing my emotions.
Yeah, good. And I feel like, you know, so I mean, one way that this can happen is maybe through being absorbed into the music, right? And a lot of religious practices pertaining with music have to do with absorption into it, where you feel this sense of not merely sympathy with, but identity with that, you know, in Sufism, for example, right? That you are the music for the duration of the music. And it's through this process of absorption and you know, as that sort of makes its way into, you know, Indonesian music as well, that absorption is the goal, in the sense of union with the music, which is meant to facilitate this higher sense of oneness with the divine, right?
The words out of my mouth. I was just going to mention Sufi dervishes and their, you know, wording, you know, which I think I'm sure viewers will have seen on YouTube and elsewhere. I play that often for my students, how, you know, Sufis aim at this kind of mystical union with the divine through the music that helps them, you know, with the chanting and singing and dancing, you know. It's just fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and so your view is very sort of receptive to practices of that sort, or at least it doesn't like dismiss them outright or anything of that sort, nor not that you would want to, but your view is very much open to that.
Certainly not. Yes, very much open to that. Yes, that's right. Though I am aware of one thing, that skeptics of these kind of experiences, of religious experiences, might say that, look, this kind of dancing, whirling, might induce certain changes in your physiology, in your brain chemistry, in your nervous system, that might induce certain visions, okay, that are not veridical, perhaps, okay, that might be explained away by neuroscience or, you know, psychology or something else. So I do want to note that, even though I'm very open to this.
One other thing that you talk about briefly in the book is the notion, and I feel like this is right too, that sometimes we feel as if it's the musical instrument that's expressing the emotion. And this feels absolutely right. If you've, you know, blues guitarists, you know, guitars, you know, it's the guitar that's crying, right? It's the guitar that's wailing. It's the saxophone that's, you know, emoting. It's not the performer necessarily. It's not a persona. It's the instrument. Could you talk just briefly about your thoughts on that? Because I think it's really an interesting thought and it feels right to me.
Sure. So once again, I think this is in the imagining in the as if mode, right? It seems to you as if the instrument is crying or wailing or dancing. Okay. In a footnote somewhere, I do mention "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," the old Beatles song. And you helped me out in your review. You mentioned Eddie Hazel's guitar on Maggot Brain, right? But again, you have the same sense. So again, I think in some ways, I think words are limited. You've got to have the experience. I mean, I don't know if I can say too much to illuminate the experience, but anyone who plays music, and you play the guitar yourself, and you mentioned blues guitar, right? You have this feeling often while playing the music that it's as if, or you might have it as a listener also, that it's as if it's the instrument that's wailing. I have that feeling sometimes. Um, I think I mentioned some in the book. I once had this experience. I was listening to Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, right? And I wasn't, listening to the music. I wasn't focused on the music. I was doing something else. And this is back in the days when people used to have CD changers. You might remember those from, I mean, I don't know if younger people might, but you'd put, 5 CDs in a CD changer. Before you know it, another CD comes on. So I had, I think, 5 CDs on a CD changer. I was doing something else. I forget what I was doing. And the new CD came on. Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue came on. It begins with this clarinet glissando, as you know, this opening clarinet glissando. Okay. And, it seemed to me as if, someone was, crying or wailing through the music, a persona, an agent in the music. Okay, and I don't know that I want to say it was a clarinet itself, but I think someone could have that kind of experience. I remember my mom saying to me many years back when I was growing up that some music she heard, maybe to the saxophone or something, it seemed like someone was wailing or crying. And this connects, of course, to the persona theory, right? There's some agent, something in the music, could be the instrument. It also connects interestingly with Peter Kivy's view, which is a vocal resemblance view, right? So I think that's one way that allows you to reconcile these views, the persona view with the vocal resemblance view. That look, when Kivy says that music is expressive in virtue of resembling the way we express our emotions vocally through our voices, the way we cry or wail or laugh or whatever, or express our joy or whatever, right? You can hear many instruments as if they are doing that, as if they are crying or wailing, okay? So that's what I will say, and then I'll leave it to your viewers and listeners. I think many people, I dare say, have had this kind of experience while listening to music or while playing music or while improvising, okay, or whatever, while composing or jamming or whatever.
Yeah, right. And stringed instruments in particular, and like guitars, the bend of the strings, right, is sort of like the lilt in the voice, right, the change in pitch.
Yes.
Yeah,
and I mean, there's another example which I mentioned in the book. Though my students often correct me, I sometimes teach these philosophy music classes where I have students from the conservatory of music, and I also have philosophy students. And the music students know a lot about music. Okay, they know more than I do often. Okay, but one of the pieces I do cite is Krzysztof Penderecki, this Polish composer, his piece Trivedi for the Victims of Hiroshima, where he uses high-pitched violins. He uses harmonics in the violins to, represent, the wailing, the crying, the anguish in Hiroshima when the atom bombs fell. Now, my music students have corrected me. They said, well, originally he wrote the music for something else, and then he later gave it this title, which I think is probably right. I'm not a musicologist. Okay, I'm not a scholar of Penderecki. I admire some of his music. But nevertheless, there is that in the music. You can hear the music as if it's the wailing of these voices, the violins playing these harmonics, very high pitches. It sounds like that, people screaming.
Yeah, well, I think we'll end it on that note. Saam, thank you so much. The book, once again, is Imagination, Music, and the Emotions, Philosophical Study from SUNY Press in 2017. Buy it just for the puppy dog on the cover, and then go through it and read an excellent book of philosophy and music. So Saam, thank you once again. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much. One last thing I will say about the cover, which is I owe that to someone who was an editorial assistant at the press at that time. Her name is Chelsea Miller. And I said to her, I'd like some whimsy in the cover. Right? A lot of covers of philosophy music books are what you might call a little bit stuffy. They're predictable. You find musical notation. You might find someone playing a wind instrument or you might find a violin, or a still life or something. And I said to the press, I'd like some whimsy. And Chelsea Miller, this assistant, she came up with a few images, 5 images. I like this, so did the press. And one of the things I like about the image is that, well, it's got imagination on it, right? It's very imaginative. It's got music on it. You got the puppy with the earbuds, and you got the emotions. The puppy seems to be in a state of bliss or some kind of joy. Okay, so you got imagination, music, and emotions, which is the title of the book. You got that in the cover too. So I kind of like that. But anyway, that's fun. But thanks again for having me. Thanks for a great conversation and for your review, which was very kind and fair-minded. You have me right. I cannot say fairly that you got me wrong. But...
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Thank you.